Late today, word of a mysterious death, an apparent suicide by a powerful athlete, a force of nature on the football field. NFL great Junior Seau, 43 years old, dead of a gunshot wound to the chest. His mother in shock tonight. And his football colleagues are asking, is this somehow another example of that legacy of the punishment players take on the field?
Punishment on the field in the form of big hits, as referenced by Diane Sawyer, has become more prevalent in the NFL as training gets better and players get bigger. Hits like these are the reason that incidents like Junior Seau's are occurring more and more often. Seau's suicide is not an isolated incident. Others, such as Ken Stabler, Tyler Sash, and Mike Webster, were all victims of the debilitating disease by the name of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, that plagued Seau. As more victims, primarily those in the limelight, continue to face the consequences of such brutal contact, people question whether the NFL has taken and is taking sufficient measures to ensure player safety in regards to concussion protocol. Since the beginning, the NFL was always a contact sport, but the intensity of the aforementioned contact was nowhere near what it is today. Helmets were an afterthought due to the lack of necessity during the early years of football. That is, until Joseph Reeves, a football player for the Naval Academy, in the late 19th century, was warned by his doctor that one more blow to the head may cause instant insanity. After the advent of the thin leather helmet around the time of Reeves, helmets were made with padding, yet still lacked face masks, which yielded many injuries. In an attempt to address this issue, the Riddell Company created the first plastic helmet along with a plastic face mask. The modernization of the NFL helmet had begun, and in the coming years, the NFL would go on to mandate all players to use helmets. Following this, the NFL continued to address these issues with motions to mandate face masks, including an unnecessary roughness penalty. The league added incremental protections for players deemed defenseless, but questions still lingered as to whether these steps were sufficient in preventing traumatic injuries.
These questions continued over the succeeding decades, as the amount of brain trauma-related deaths in football perpetually increased. The late 1950s to the 1960s saw a consistent rise in these deaths, strengthening the already present concerns. As this rise progressed, proponents of medicine and safety called for research of head injuries in football, much to the chagrin of the NFL. Despite the NFL's refusal to acknowledge the issue, studies were proving that there were indeed dangers in the game. For example, the severity of multiple concussions sustained by a player during a game, now known as second impact syndrome, was documented to be potentially life-threatening for players. Facts like these, along with other growing evidence, called for major changes to be made, but still, the NFL would not go public with the safety concerns. The NFL owners were not looking to change the game. The hard hits in football were what made it so successful and popular, even though these plays often sacrificed the bodies and brains of players. As a result, changes to the beloved sport were hard to enact, even with conclusive medical research. It wasn't until 1994 that the NFL first began to review this issue formally and recognize the dangers of concussions in their sport. The commissioner of the NFL, Paul Tagliabue, approved of the creation of the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee to primarily study the effects of concussions and subconcussive injuries in NFL players, in an attempt to assuage fears of inaction and work towards a more safe league. The NFL will later prove this move to be a symbolic one, when confronted with an actual opportunity to make substantial change. The American Academy of Neurology published their own set of guidelines for working with players who were concussed in-game in 1997, imploring the NFL to accept these guidelines and remove players from games following head trauma. The NFL soundly and unequivocally rejected this notion. This action, or rather inaction, once again proved valid the concerns of safety and medicine proponents who held that the NFL was not doing enough. The evidence that concussions in-game led to lasting damage in players began to mount. The case of Mike Webster, a Hall of Fame center for the Pittsburgh Steelers, was a turning point in the history of football that changed the game forever. After Mike's death in 2002, Dr. Bennett Omalu was assigned to perform an autopsy to assess the damage football had done to Mike's body. Being a neuropathologist, Omalu was interested in studying the brain and, in doing so, discovered that Mike had been suffering from CTE, a disease that had never been found in football players. CTE is a progressive degenerative brain disease that causes depression, memory loss, and dementia, and the fact that this early onset degeneration was found in a 50-year-old man's brain was startling. Omalu went on to publish his findings with the thought that the NFL would appreciate and be pleased with what he found. They weren't. In fact, the NFL intentionally tried to discredit his findings by saying they had serious flaws. It was during this time that the controversy of the severity of concussions grew exponentially. The following years brought much debate to the issue. On one side, the NFL's MTBI committee continually published findings that refuted the need to call any attention to concussions in the game. Their studies maintain that most concussed players recover quickly and can return to play within the same game, disputed effects of repeated concussions, and even claimed that NFL players were actually less susceptible to brain injury. But the other side was publishing findings as well, as Omalu was finding more and more football players that suffered from CTE, while other doctors also found evidence regarding the dangers of concussions. This battle between the league and the concerned public went on for years, and it wasn't until 2009 that the NFL finally acknowledged that there were long-term effects of brain trauma like concussions in the sport. Following this admission, tension and arguments continued between the two sides, but even so, major changes were being made. More and more safety rules were being implemented, including that if a player's helmet comes off, the ball is immediately dead in 2010, and moving up the restraining line for kickoff team to help further protect receiving players from dangerous hits in 2011. Rule changes like these, as well as others, were set to create a safer game, but hard hits and head injuries continued and still continue today, as much as the physicality of football cannot be taken away. As we know, football today is still a widely popular and successful sport. Although the NFL has taken some steps to create a safer game, the issue with head injuries still remains. The number of CTE cases continues to rise, as do the NFL players that have committed suicide, and these depressing statistics drive the continuing controversy. Even so, the NFL still takes its stance against the problem, as just recently the NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell expressed his support for the game by stating concussions are down 35% since 2012, and that he believes football is safer than ever before.
The player safety has to be our priority, and it is our priority throughout the NFL.
He even said that he would encourage his own children to play, even with the dangers that are involved.
A lot of people have come out and said they wouldn't let their kids play football because of the health risks.
In fact, if I had a son, I would be real leery of him playing.
He's not alone, though, as many NFL players also express their love for the game. They wouldn't stop playing even with the risks. With this in mind, change is a hard undertaking even with the growing evidence against the game. Even though the major conflict and concern of whether football is safe enough, and if the league does enough to promote this safety, there is still support for this loved sport, and because of this, the game will continue.